So look, I got a haircut. Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and this video is the beginning of a new series of rethinking critical theory videos on the topic of Jean Baudrillard. Jean Baudrillard. We'll be reading two of his books together, The Mirror of Production and The Consumer Society. Along the way, in this video, I'll take a couple of excerpts from the books Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher, as always, and also a new book coming out soon called A Left for Itself by David Swift. So as we try to deconstruct consumer society, I'll be here pushing the product on you. The best way to understand Baudrillard is to understand Nanterre University, or at least to get the beginnings of an understanding. Having opened its doors in 1964, Nanterre was the definition of the modern French university. While officially connected to the Sorbonne, Nanterre was a very different institution that broke from the traditional French university system. Where the Sorbonne was integrated into Paris, Nanterre was erected in a working-class suburb and stood apart from the surrounding neighborhoods that housed mostly Algerian nationals after the Algerian War of Independence was won in 1962. Nanterre's university was built on the American model, which is described in an essay by Professor Paul Kapp and written for the peer-reviewed academic journal Built Heritage this way. From the American colonial colleges, Harvard University, the College of William and Mary, and Yale University, the concept of town and gown, a physical separation between the academy and the metropole, developed. The primary reason why the campus came into existence in this way in early America was to separate the impressionable young students, who were all male, from the profane and vulgar business of the city. The explanation for this change, for the attempt to include working class and migrant Nanterre in the French system of education through the use of an American-style campus, is explained in economic and political terms by the socialist journalist Daniel Singer, who, writing in 1970, said that while the changes in France were not immediately apparent on the surface of everyday life, quote, the economic and social shape of France has probably been altered as drastically in the last 20 years as that of any other Western European country. The country had undergone massive proletarianization and urbanization as rural farming was replaced by industrial jobs. Again, from Singer, after World War II, about 36% of the jobs in France involved farming, but by 1968, the percentage was down to 15%. This change in productive life came along with a change in the character of leisure and consumption. As France increased exports and imports, the provincial character of the country was challenged and then overturned. The introduction of American-style education was, to a large degree, the result of this change in production. France needed a workforce that was technically literate and that could function in a more abstract and technically challenging environment. Around the time of the protests and factory occupations of May 1968, around the time when at least 2 million French workers went on strike without the support of the CGT or the Communist Party, the French economy was beginning to stagnate. With slow growth, tight financial controls, foreign competition, and an uptick in unemployment as employers stopped retaining labor year-round but laid them off during slack periods, the young workers in Nanterre became restive. This was the background as student unrest grew, and it all started at Nanterre University. Before '68, Jean Baudrillard was already an academic whose work included translating the works of Bertolt Brecht and publishing in Simone de Beauvoir's journal Modern Times. In 1963, he became friendly with the neo-Marxist Henri Lefebvre and the structuralist cultural critic Roland Barthes. and by 1966, Baudrillard had entered Nanterre as Lefebvre's assistant. I know what you're thinking. So far, this video hasn't really covered anything about Jean Baudrillard, but we will get to him soon. But before we do, I just want to take a quick detour and talk about Henri Lefebvre. Henri Lefebvre was already 65 years old in 1966, but he was hardly ready to retire. This neo-Marxist had been seeking philosophical revolution since 1924, and he'd been seriously involved in Marxist politics since joining the PCF, or French Communist Party, in 1928. Lefebvre broke with the Soviet Union relatively early, writing an anti-Stalinist book called Dialectical Materialism in 1940, and writing the first in his 3-volume series called The Critique of Everyday Life in 1947. The Critique of Everyday Life is particularly interesting, as it represents a sustained effort to engage in critical theory or radical philosophy over a period of 34 years. Lefebvre started his critique around the beginning of the television era and ended it in the very early days of the internet. Lefebvre was a fellow traveler and a frequent target of the French radical group the Situationist International, who, along with, or maybe through Lefebvre, influenced Baudrillard, and who took credit for instigating the May 1968 uprisings in Paris. Considering that Lefebvre is one of those figures who found himself in the fortunate position of influencing history from the margins, we should consider what he had to say in 1947, some 23 years before Baudrillard published The Consumer Society. The Critique of Everyday Life begins with some literary criticism. Lefebvre notices how 19th century artistic and literary movements, with their pessimism, their conviction that civilization itself leads to decadence, had given way to artistic movements based on libertine cynicism. Lefebvre notes that this new embrace of adventure and sensuousness implied not the overcoming of 19th century pessimism, not the overcoming of ennui and loneliness, but rather only the dissolution of social relations under the weight of an advancing capitalist society. A feeling of loss is pervasive in Lefebvre. He often seems to long for the rural life that he sees disappearing, to wish for a return to the authenticity that he perhaps associates with the 19th century and earlier. And in the 2nd volume of The Critique of Everyday Life, Lefebvre writes, quote, "Without the experience of need and want, without actual or potential privation and destitution, there can be no being consciousness, and freedom will never spring forth." Now, to say this seems to go against Marx's dream of cutting the fetters that hold back the forces of production. Marx's dream of freeing the productive forces capitalism has created from the capitalist logic. But we can't simple-mindedly condemn Lefebvre for heresy. Rather, we have to take up the problems he presents us with. And this is perhaps what Baudrillard attempts to do. Baudrillard's The Consumer Society picks up on Lefebvre's sentiment that deprivation is as important an ingredient for cooking up human freedom as creativity and power. The big department stores, with their abundance of canned foods and clothing, of foodstuffs and ready-made garments, are like the primal landscape, the geometrical locus of abundance. But every street, with its cluttered, glittering shop windows, the displays of cooked meats, and indeed the entire alimentary and vestimentary feast, all stimulate magical salivation. There's something more in this piling high than the quantity of products, the manifest presence of surplus, the magical, definitive negation of scarcity, the maternal, luxurious sense of being already in the land of Cockaigne. Now, the land of Cockaigne is a mythical land that was first told of during the 12th century. the land of cocaine, was a dream of peasants who longed to escape from backbreaking labor and from the threat of starvation. But over the years, this myth was transformed from a utopian vision into a warning against avarice and gluttony. Baudrillard sides with Bruegel and Veblen as he takes on consumer society as a den of gluttony.
Hamburgers at McDonald's are fun.
In the introduction to Baudrillard's book on consumerism, written in 1998 by George Ritzer, known for his book, The McDonaldization of Society, this summary of Baudrillard's early work in general is given. Quote, while most of his contemporaries in France and elsewhere were mired in stale old debates about production, Baudrillard recognized that consumption was where the important new issues and problems were to be found. End quote. Unfortunately, this description isn't entirely wrong. Not only does Baudrillard hold with the conviction that freedom from want inevitably leads to decadence, he justifies this conviction through a misreading and a rejection of Marx. The primary misreading involves Marx's notion of the commodity and the way that the creation of an abstract labor value through a system of capitalist production sets up what Marx called the commodity fetish. Baudrillard wrote that we have to describe commodities as we see and experience them, never forgetting in their splendor and profusion that they are the product of a human activity and are dominated not by natural ecological laws, but by the law of exchange value. And he follows this up with a quote from Marx's economic manuscripts, the bit where Marx describes the shops of London as teeming with commodities from around the world. But it's important to notice that this section of Marx's economic manuscripts is not aimed at critiquing commodity production for the way it creates conspicuous consumption, nor is Marx concerned with greed or gluttony. Instead, he is aiming at explaining both the limit of simple commodity exchange, that is, the limited dynamic of the circuit wherein a producer sells his own privately produced commodity for gold that he then uses to buy another commodity that he intends to consume himself, and the role that money has in an actual capitalist society. Useful goods that are produced and then exchanged amongst private producers aimed at private consumption is not that different than goods produced for barter, Marx says. However, with the creation of the universal equivalent known as money, a new system dominated not by useful things, but by what Marx called value, is on the horizon. For Marx, the commodity took on a fetish character not because of a simple exchange of one use value for another use value, but because of the creation of a class of commodities that can be used to produce more of the universal equivalent money than was present at the start. When useful things are produced with the aim not of meeting human needs, but with the aim of producing more money, when the usefulness of an item is of little significance when compared to the universality of money, then we have entered the realm of capitalism. And in this realm, the most important commodity known as money, isn't consumed at all, but just grows and grows. It becomes more important than the human beings who serve it, more important than any particular desire. Baudrillard would have us worry about the abundance of canned foods, clothing, of foodstuffs and ready-made garments, but what he misses is that this abundance relies on the continual growth of the commodity money, and that even as the world's warehouses are filled up with grain, with Coca-Cola bottles, with the wonders of the world, the people in it can starve if the production of money and profit goes awry. And according to Marx, production of money always goes awry.
This is an extraordinary period for America's economy. Over the past few weeks, many Americans have felt anxiety about their finances and their future. I understand their worry and their frustration. We've seen triple-digit swings in the stock market. Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed. As uncertainty has grown, many banks have restricted lending. Credit markets have frozen, And families and businesses have found it harder to borrow money. We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action.
In his third book, The Mirror of Production, Baudrillard doubles down on his mistaken reading of Marx. He begins by quoting the German ideology. Quote, "The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy human needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this is an historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely in order to sustain human life." But Baudrillard doubts the primacy of productive work, and he asks whether Marx has confused the liberation of productive forces with the liberation of man. To Baudrillard's ears, this idea of freedom from want, the idea of actualizing man's freedom to create, sounds only like the formula of political economy that Marx says he wants to get beyond. The answer from Marx would be this. First, the historical act of production, or transforming the natural world for our own wants, is not the first act of human survival, but the first act of self-consciousness and reflection. As Marx pointed out in the Critique of the Gotha program, nature along with labor are sources of wealth. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of B is this. The architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. Now, Baudrillard would ask, as he does in The Mirror of Production, why must man's vocation always be to distinguish himself from animals? But Marx might answer, as I will right now, because evolution is slow, and because people live in social worlds and not natural ones. Without a category of the human in subjectivity, there can be no social change. And without a way to create change, humanity cannot be free. Without understanding ourselves as ourselves, without taking hold of our own activity, taking responsibility for it, we will treat each other like herd animals, or like lobsters. We will presume that the power structures that already are have always been. That is, if we went to the mall yesterday, we must go to the mall again tomorrow. Now, having said all of that, there are good reasons to admire Baudrillard, just as there are reasons to admire other conservative critiques of capitalism and modernity. Like Veblen, Baudrillard's critique has caught on. The problem of commercialization, of consumerism, is a popular one. To judge one another based on the types or the frequency of our purchases, to worry about whether one is living authentically or being duped by shoddy merchandise. All of this is not only easy to grasp, but also has a ring of truth to it. But still, there's a deeper critique. The late Mark Fisher started his book, Capitalist Realism, by noting that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I would add that it is also easier to imagine the death of the real, the destruction of the concept of reality itself, than it is to think of the end of the capitalist mode of production. In his book, A Left for Itself, David Swift describes one of the major differences between middle-class left activists and working-class people with far less wealth backing them. Left activists tend to think in terms of identity and belonging, whereas the working class thinks in terms of generating wealth and opportunity. One of the reasons Marx sided with the working class was because he shared this outlook. The trouble with capitalism was not that it empowered humanity too much. The problem was not that it delivered humanity from privation and created gluttons, but rather that it got in its own way, that it set people against each other, in competition for an unnecessary abstraction. The difficulty was that capitalism required that there would always be masses of people with very limited wealth and with very limited or very few opportunities. It may have seemed like I've been coming down pretty hard on Jean Baudrillard, but in fact, I think that reading his work is very worthwhile because it's through reading him and others like him that we can understand the turn that the left took after May 1968, say specifically. By retracing our own thinking and our own history, we might be able to more easily correct course. So in the next video, we'll take a closer look at that history of the history of May 1968, and we'll press on with the mirror of production and the consumer society. Expect that in October. The next one of these on Baudrillard will be in October. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.